So we were looking at the new covenant in the last few sessions, and we must remember that the first people who heard about the new covenant were people who were under the old covenant, and therefore they could appreciate it more. The tragedy with Christians today is they've never been under the old covenant. They straight away hear about the new covenant, and they can't appreciate it enough. And so they never really enter into the new covenant. I'll give you an example. In the old covenant, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And they were taught to fear God. And in the new covenant, the main word is the grace of God. So if you hear about the grace of God without having practiced the fear of God, you never come into it. The fear of God made people so scared to do wrong things in the old covenant, a person who really feared God. But all those early disciples were people who had been brought up at home to fear God for 30 years. And then they heard about the grace of God and they appreciated it. Whereas that's the reason why so many Christians today who straight away hear about the grace of God live such backslidden lives, never enter into a life of victory. So when Jesus came, he said that we must go into all the world and make disciples. So when we think of the new covenant, we cannot think of it apart from discipleship. If a person wants to enter into the new covenant, he must first be a disciple. Because that's what Jesus said. We must go into every part of the world and make disciples. And that's another thing Christians have not obeyed. They've told people about how to go to heaven. Most gospel preaching is how to escape hell, how to go to heaven. Anywhere. I mean, you go to the internet or you go any public gospel meeting, it's not about discipleship. It's about how to go to heaven and how to escape hell. And many of us have heard that type of gospel. It's the earliest gospel we heard. And we have not sufficiently heard about discipleship, and then you can never enter into the new covenant. So I want to say something about what Jesus said about discipleship if you want to enter the new covenant. Luke chapter 14. Luke 14, it says, great crowds were going along with Jesus, and he turned and said to them some of the strongest words on how to be a disciple. Now, today, if great crowds come to hear a preacher or a pastor, they say, let's pass the offering bag before this crowd goes away. That's a sad state of Christendom today. That they're more interested in collecting money from these people than leading them to become disciples. There are very few churches that consistently preach discipleship. There are thousands of churches that just collect money. So what are the conditions of discipleship he gave here? 3 times he said here in verse 26 to 33, he cannot be my disciple, he cannot be my disciple, he cannot be my disciple. So we want to look at those 3. First of all, in verse 26, the 3 conditions of discipleship. He said, if you come to me, was Luke 14:26, and you do not hate your father, and you not hate your mother, you don't hate your wife, you don't hate your children, you don't hate your brothers and sisters, you just cannot be my disciple. Now, all of you brothers and sisters, you've been Christians for a long time. Can you tell me the last time you heard anybody preach that to you on that verse? Even though that is the number 1 condition of discipleship, and Jesus said, go into all the world and make disciples. So what were the preachers you heard in past years telling you? And they never taught you this verse? They never labored to emphasize this verse? Well, I want to do it today. Now, you cannot enter into the new covenant before entering into the old covenant. And the old covenant was honor your father and mother. So don't try to hate father and mother before you honor your father and mother. Remember, the old covenant is first. And the old covenant is you honor your father and mother. And if you go to Proverbs chapter 30, there are some terrible curses written there for people who don't speak kindly to their father or the mother, etc. Some terrible curses. This is how the old covenant was. They were, in fact, if a rebellious son was usually taken out of the city premises and killed for rebelling against the father. That was old covenant. Respect and honor your father and mother. And all of us know the meaning of respect and honor. Now, if you have not learned that, if you have not learned to honor your earthly parents, you cannot become a disciple first, because this is the second step. The same thing with wife and children. The Bible says you must love your wife like Christ loved the church in the new covenant. In the old covenant, there was not many commandments to put about husband-wife relationships, but a man was supposed to be loyal to his wife. He was not supposed to commit adultery. He was supposed to be faithful. And there are commands in the Old Testament to bring up your children, train up your child in the way he should go. When he's old, he will not depart from it. There was a number of commands in the book of Proverbs to bring up your children in the fear of God. Now, if you have not brought up your children in the fear of God from childhood, don't forget about the new covenant. Don't even come to this verse. You cannot come here. The old people who have not feared God, those commands in the Old Testament, people feared God and kept them. And I believe this is one of the main reasons why in practical life people never enter the blessings of the new covenant. The blessing of the new covenant is, first of all, that you can live a life of overcoming sin every day. It's not just some days of the week. And you can gradually increase in likeness to Christ in your speech, in your character, in your behavior, and many other areas. But it begins here. In other words, the point here is, I'm going to put Christ above my father, above my mother, above my wife, and above my children, above all the brothers and sisters. And if there's a choice, it's what Jesus says that's going to matter, and not what my dad says, or what my brother says, or what my wife says, or husband says. Now, there are a lot of people, for example, as I said, who don't want to submit to their husbands, who are delighted to hear something like this. Great, I'm going to listen to Christ, not my husband. So that's why I said you got to start with honoring your father and mother, loving your wife, loving your children, bringing them up in a godly way. Then you come to this, where you put Christ first. Now, I mentioned that because there are people who can just come to this verse and say, yeah, I want to do that. I want to hate my father. I want to hate my mother. I want to hate my wife. I'm already doing it in any case. That's not discipleship. That is carnality. So I say that because that's what's happening in some cases. So what does this mean? It means in practical terms that nobody is more important to me. No voice is more important in my heart than the voice of Jesus Christ. If the Lord tells me to do something, it doesn't matter if my wife objects. It doesn't matter if I'm willing to offend her. I'm willing to hurt her every day of my life if I have to obey Jesus Christ. I'm not going to be influenced by my unconverted father tells me, or unconverted mother tells me. I'm going to obey Christ. It's very important to take this decision, because I know numerous people in India who claim to be born-again Christians who have umpteen problems in their life and in their married life, because they don't put Christ as his voice is more important than the voice of anybody else in their life. So before we go to the next step, you need to ask yourself, or your children. There are people who love their children more than they love Christ. That means they permit their children to do a lot of things which they know that the Lord will not permit. For children want to watch something which is not good for them. If Christ is supreme, there's an answer to all those things immediately. You don't even have to think about it. So this is very important, is the number one condition of discipleship, that no human being will be more important to me than Jesus Christ. If there's a choice between Christ and any human being, it be my wife, children, or whoever you love the most, think of the one you love the most in your life. Is Christ more important than you? In a practical situation, if you have a choice between what the Lord tells you to do and what that other person tells you to do, will you obey Christ? That is the test of discipleship. Then we can enter into the new covenant.